At what I believed would be the deciding hearing in the family court, I was 8 months pregnant when a sharp pain tore through my belly, so suddenly I grabbed the edge of the mahogany table. For 1 second, I couldn't breathe. My solicitor turned toward me. Isolde, across the courtroom, my mother-in-law, Sybil, leaned back in her chair and chuckled under her breath. "She's faking it again," Sybil said loud enough for the clerks to hear. My husband, Alaric, didn't even look concerned. He just smirked at the judge like this was exactly what he had predicted. "She always pulls this stunt to delay proceedings," he said calmly. "Your Honor, this is what I've been talking about." The judge looked at me with narrowed eyes. Not cruelly, but with palpable doubt. And that doubt hurt almost worse than the physical pain. Because for months, Alaric had painted me as unstable, dramatic, and manipulative. A woman who cried medical emergency whenever life stopped going her way. I tried to speak, but another contraction rolled through me. Deeper this time, low and brutal. "Your Honor," my solicitor said, standing quickly. "My client needs immediate medical assistance." Alaric's barrister gave a tired sigh, stating they would object to another adjournment. Another adjournment. As if my body had scheduled this. As if my unborn child was part of a legal strategy. I pressed both hands to my stomach and whispered, "Something's wrong," Sybil scoffed. "There it is!" Then my water broke. There was no dramatic sound, no warning, just warmth spreading beneath me and then spilling onto the polished courtroom floor. The room went silent. The court usher moved first. He rushed toward me, glanced down, and his face changed instantly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice sharp now. "She's in labor." Someone gasped behind me. My husband's smirk vanished. A second later, the usher shouted, "Call 999. The judge rose slowly from the bench. This time there was no doubt in his eyes. "This hearing is suspended immediately," he said. Then he turned to the clerk. "Make sure the record reflects exactly what occurred in this courtroom, including the statements made before the medical emergency was confirmed." Alaric's face went pale. Sybil stopped laughing, and as paramedics rushed in, as my solicitor held my hand and told me to keep breathing, I looked once across the courtroom at the man who had spent months calling me a liar. He had no idea. None of them did. They thought I had walked into that courtroom defenseless. They were wrong. 4 months earlier, I was standing barefoot in my kitchen at 6:12 inches the morning, watching Alaric whisper into his phone on the back terrace. It was March, still cold enough that the glass door fogged around the edges. He was in pajama bottoms and a gray sweatshirt, one hand tucked under his arm, his voice too low for me to hear. Before my pregnancy, Alaric had never been secretive. He used to leave his phone on the counter. He answered calls on speaker. He complained loudly about clients, vendors, rugby mates, and his mother's endless opinions. But after I got pregnant, everything changed. At first, I blamed stress. We owned a small commercial flooring firm together in the West Midlands. Alaric handled sales and job sites. I handled payroll, accounts, vendor contracts, taxes, scheduling, and the 1,000 invisible tasks that kept our lives from collapsing. A baby meant change. I understood that. But Alaric didn't seem nervous. He seemed strategic. He started taking calls outside. He changed passwords. He began coming home late from meetings that never appeared on the company diary. He opened a new current account and told me it was just for operating expenses. Then his mother started coming over twice a week. Sybil had never liked me much, but after the pregnancy, her dislike became polished and purposeful. She brought soup I hadn't asked for, folded baby clothes I had already washed, and made comments so soft Alaric could pretend not to hear them. "You look tired, Isolde. Are you sure you're emotionally ready for motherhood?" Pregnancy can make women irrational, everyone knows that. One evening, while Alaric sat at the dining table scrolling through his phone, Sybil touched my shoulder and smiled. "You need rest, sweetheart. Maybe Alaric should be making more decisions right now." I looked at her hand on me, then at Alaric. He didn't say a word. That was when I understood something was happening around me, not with me. 2 days later, I found the first transfer. It was £15,000 moved from our joint business reserve account into a vendor payment category I didn't recognize. The vendor name looked legitimate at first glance, Sterling Estates Consultancy, but I paid the real vendors. I knew every company we worked with. Sterling wasn't one of them. I sat at my desk after midnight, the house dark except for my laptop screen. One hand rested against my stomach while the baby kicked under my ribs. I clicked deeper. 3 transfers. Same name. Different amounts. All approved by Alaric. My first instinct was to confront him. I even walked upstairs and stood outside our bedroom, listening to him snore like a man with nothing on his conscience. But I stopped myself because if Alaric was hiding money, asking him about it would only teach him to hide it better, so I did something I had never done in my marriage. I said nothing. The next morning, I kissed him goodbye. I packed his lunch. I smiled when he told me he had another late meeting. Then I drove to a solicitor's office across town. Her name was Elspeth Thorne, and she didn't waste time pretending my situation was simple. She listened carefully while I explained the transfers, the phone calls, the password changes, Sybil's involvement, and Alaric's sudden interest in protecting business continuity. When I finished, she tapped her pen once against her legal pad. "Isolde," she said. "Has your husband mentioned divorce?" My mouth went dry. "No." "Has he mentioned child arrangements?" I shook my head. "Not directly. Has he asked you to sign anything recently?" I thought of the packet Alaric had left on the kitchen counter 2 nights earlier. Something about restructuring shares in the company before the baby arrived. I had not signed it. Elspeth saw my face. "Do not sign anything without sending it to me first." I nodded. Then she leaned forward. "If he is moving money and building a narrative about your mental state, you need to assume those 2 things are connected." Building a narrative. The phrase stayed with me. After that, I began paying attention differently. I stopped reacting. I started recording, not illegally, not recklessly, but carefully. I saved emails, downloaded statements, copied invoices, and took screenshots of calendar changes before they disappeared. I wrote down dates, times, witnesses, and comments. When Alaric said I was too emotional to handle payroll, I documented it. When Sybil told our neighbor I was having episodes, I documented it. When Alaric claimed an antenatal appointment was another excuse to avoid responsibility, I documented that too. And all the while, I played the part they expected. The tired wife, the overwhelmed mother-to-be, a woman too pregnant and too emotional to notice the walls moving around her. Then, 6 weeks before the hearing, Alaric finally said the word, divorce. He did it at the kitchen island while eating cereal. "I think we both know this isn't working," he said. I looked at him for a long moment. My baby shifted inside me. "What isn't working?" He sighed like I was exhausting him. "Us, Isolde. This marriage." Sybil's car was parked outside. Of course it was. Alaric pushed a folder toward me. "We can make this easy. Sign the agreement and there doesn't have to be a fight." I opened the folder. He wanted control of the company, a reduced property settlement, and child arrangements settled before the baby was even born. And tucked inside the language, quiet but unmistakable, were claims about my emotional instability and repeated inability to manage stress. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not fear, but clarity. I closed the folder and looked at him. "I need time to read it." His jaw tightened. "Don't drag this out." Behind him, through the window, I saw Sybil sitting in her car, watching the house. I gave Alaric the soft, tired smile he had come to underestimate. "I won't," I said, and I meant it. I wasn't going to drag anything out. I was going to build something so complete that when the truth finally entered a courtroom, it would not need to shout. It would only need to be read aloud. So when I walked into court 4 months later, swollen, exhausted, and aching, they believed I was alone. They believed silence meant weakness. They believed pregnancy had made me fragile. But inside my solicitor's briefcase were bank records, emails, timelines, phone logs, company documents, and proof of every lie they thought I had missed. Alaric had spent months preparing to destroy my credibility. I had spent those same months preparing to prove his. The weeks after Alaric handed me the divorce papers settled into a rhythm that felt impossible to sustain. Every morning started before sunrise. I would wake to the baby kicking against my ribs, lie still for a moment until the nausea eased, then swing my swollen legs over the side of the bed. By 6, I was answering vendor emails with a cup of peppermint tea because coffee had started making me sick. By 8, I was either at the office or sitting in an antenatal waiting room. By noon, I was reviewing payroll. By afternoon, I was in meetings with my solicitor. By evening, I was organizing financial records. By night, I was documenting everything that had happened that day before. Exhaustion finally pulled me under. There wasn't room for grief, only work. At one of my antenatal appointments, Dr. Abernathy frowned as she studied my blood pressure. "You're running too high again. I've been under a little stress." She gave me a look that suggested we both knew I had just delivered the understatement of the year. Isolde, stress isn't just making you uncomfortable anymore. It's affecting this pregnancy. She rotated the ultrasound screen toward me. Our daughter stretched one tiny arm, then curled back into herself. She looks good, the doctor said gently, but your body is working harder than it should. I'll slow down. You've told me that twice already. I couldn't argue. She was right. Listen carefully, Dr. Abernathy continued. You need rest. Reduce stress. If you keep pushing yourself like this, you're increasing the risk of preterm labor. The words landed heavily. Preterm labor. I rested my hand on my stomach. I understand. Do you? I wanted to tell her everything, that I wasn't chasing money or trying to punish my husband. I was trying to make sure my daughter wasn't born into a future built on lies. Instead, I simply nodded. I'll do my best. As soon as I left the clinic, I drove directly to Elspeth's office. She already had folders spread across the conference table. Good timing, she said. I found something. She slid a stack of bank statements toward me. Look at the dates. I scanned the transfers to Sterling Estates Consultancy. Another payment, then another, then another. Nearly £150,000 over 3 months. I've called every supplier on your vendor list, Elspeth said. Nobody has ever heard of this company. So, it's fake. Maybe. She pointed farther down the page. Or it's being used to hide marital assets. I stared at the numbers. Alaric hadn't just been moving money. He'd been emptying the future we'd built together. If we wait too long, Elspeth said quietly, those funds could become much harder to recover. That became the moment I stopped wondering whether I should keep investigating. I couldn't afford not to. Every day that passed gave Alaric another opportunity to bury evidence. Meanwhile, life inside our house became stranger. Alaric acted almost cheerful. He cooked dinner twice a week, asked whether I needed groceries, and even offered to assemble the baby's cot. If someone had walked through our front door, they might have thought we were a couple calmly preparing for parenthood. But every kindness felt rehearsed. Every conversation seemed designed to create witnesses. One Saturday afternoon, Sybil came over while Alaric was working in the garage. She watched me lower myself carefully into a kitchen chair. My goodness, she said. You're out of breath just sitting down. I'm 8 months pregnant. She smiled. Some women handle pregnancy better than others. Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. It was our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, returning a Le Creuset dish. Sybil greeted her warmly. Oh, Mrs. Higgins, thank you. Isolde's been having another difficult week. Mrs. Higgins looked concerned. Oh, is everything okay? Sybil sighed dramatically. Poor thing gets overwhelmed so easily these days. Sometimes she says she's too sick to even get out of bed. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so deliberate. I had never said that. Not once. Mrs. Higgins looked at me. I smiled politely. I'm doing fine. Sybil patted my arm. See, she's always trying to be brave. After Mrs. Higgins left, Sybil's pleasant expression disappeared. You should learn when to accept help. I don't remember asking for any. She leaned closer. You will. Then she walked out to the garage where Alaric was waiting. I stood alone in the kitchen. For the first time, I realized they weren't simply talking about me. They were performing. Every conversation had an audience. Every interaction planted another seed. Emotionally unstable, frequently ill, unable to cope. It wasn't random. It was a narrative, exactly as Elspeth had warned. Fortunately for me, performances often leave evidence. Alaric had become careless because he believed I was too overwhelmed to notice. One evening, he forgot his laptop on the dining room table while he showered. The screen was unlocked. I had no intention of snooping through private messages, but an email notification appeared before my eyes. Subject line: Child Arrangement Strategy. My heart pounded. I opened it. The email wasn't from his solicitor. It was from Sybil. Remember what the counselor said. Keep documenting every time Isolde claims she's too sick, too emotional, or too overwhelmed. The court needs to see a pattern. Below it, Alaric had replied, already working on it. I immediately took photographs with my phone. Then I closed the email exactly as I'd found it. My hands shook for nearly an hour afterward. That night, I forwarded the photographs to Elspeth. She called me before 9 the next morning. Do not tell him you saw this. I won't. This is important. It proves they're planning it. It proves intent. There was a long pause. Then she added quietly, people don't accidentally create false narratives over several months. The evidence kept growing. a deleted calendar appointment that still appeared in a cloud backup, text messages discussing wire transfers, an invoice with mismatched tax information, security footage from our office showing Alaric removing boxes of financial records after business hours, despite telling employees he was cleaning. Each piece alone raised questions. Together, they told a story. Ironically, the harder Alaric worked to make me look unreliable, the less careful he became about hiding his own conduct. But my body was beginning to protest. The contractions started as occasional tightening across my abdomen. Dr. Abernathy called them Braxton Hicks. Normal, she said, unless they become regular. I didn't tell her they were becoming more frequent. I didn't tell Elspeth either. Every time another wave of pressure came, I would stop walking, breathe slowly, wait for it to pass, and continue organizing another folder. One afternoon, while carrying a banker's box from my office to my car, the tightening became so intense I had to lean against the door. A receptionist hurried over. "Are you okay?" I forced a smile. "Just pregnancy." She offered to call someone. "I'm fine." I wasn't. But stopping now felt more dangerous than continuing. If I paused for weeks of bed rest, Alaric would have time to finish whatever he had started. Assets could disappear. Witnesses could coordinate their stories. Documents could be destroyed. I hated that I was making those calculations while carrying my daughter. Every decision felt like choosing between protecting my child today and protecting her future tomorrow. The hearing date arrived faster than I expected. 3 days before court, Elspeth spread every piece of evidence across her conference table. Bank records, emails, financial statements, phone logs, witness notes, corporate filings. She looked at me. "They think you'll come into court reacting emotionally." I nodded. "They're counting on it." She closed the final binder. "So don't." I rested my hand over my stomach as another tightening rippled beneath my ribs. It lasted longer than the last one. Long enough for Elspeth to notice the change in my face. "You all right?" "Just another contraction." She frowned. "Have you called Dr. Abernathy?" "They're not regular." She held my gaze for a moment. "Promise me something." "What?" "If your body tells you to stop, you stop." I wanted to promise. I truly did. Instead, I looked at the neat stack of binders that represented 4 months of quiet preparation. I just need to get through the hearing. As I walked out of her office that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that time itself had become my greatest opponent. Alaric thought he only had to defeat me. I knew I had to outrun both his deception and my own failing strength. I just prayed my daughter could wait a few more days. The morning of the hearing began before dawn. I had barely slept. Every time I rolled over, pressure settled lower in my abdomen. The contractions had been coming and going through the night, never quite regular enough to convince me they were real labor, but strong enough to remind me that Dr. Abernathy's warnings had not been empty. Alaric, of course, had moved into a flat in the city 6 weeks earlier. I was alone in the house. I showered slowly, packed a folder with antenatal records just in case, and checked my briefcase one final time. The evidence binders were exactly where they belonged. Emails, bank statements, corporate records, phone logs, photographs. Months of quiet work compressed into 4 carefully labeled binders. As I locked the front door behind me, I rested one hand against my stomach. "Just a little longer," I whispered. Whether I was talking to my daughter or to myself, I wasn't entirely sure. Elspeth met me outside the courthouse. The moment she saw me, she frowned. "You look exhausted." "I feel exhausted." "When did you last sleep?" I laughed softly. "I'll sleep after this is over." She wasn't amused. "Any more contractions?" I hesitated. "A few." "Regular?" "No." She searched my face. "If anything changes, we stop." "I know. No arguments." I nodded. But inside, I already knew I wasn't leaving that courtroom voluntarily. Not unless someone physically carried me out. We walked through security together. The courthouse buzzed with ordinary business. People paying fines, solicitors greeting one another in the hallway, families waiting outside courtrooms. To everyone else, it was another Tuesday. To me, it felt like walking onto a battlefield. Alaric stood outside Court 3, speaking quietly with his barrister. He wore the navy suit I'd bought him for our 10th wedding anniversary. For one brief second, seeing him in it hurt more, not because I missed him, but because I remembered the man I thought he had been. He noticed us approaching. His expression remained perfectly composed. "Morning," he said. "Alaric." He glanced at my stomach. "You look uncomfortable." "I'm pregnant. I just hope you're feeling well enough to get through today." His tone sounded concerned. His eyes didn't. Sybil arrived moments later, carrying a leather handbag and a travel coffee mug. She smiled as if she were attending a charity gala. Isolde, Sybil, she looked me up and down. I was beginning to wonder whether you'd actually show up. I said I would. Well, she replied pleasantly. Sometimes you say a lot of things. Elspeth stepped slightly between us. We'll see you inside. Court began promptly at 9. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Once the formalities ended, Alaric's barrister rose immediately. Your Honor, my client respectfully requests that today's hearing proceed without further delay. This matter has already experienced multiple scheduling complications. He didn't mention that most of those scheduling changes had involved routine disclosure deadlines. He wanted the word delay hanging in the room. The judge nodded. We'll proceed. For the first hour, everything remained procedural. Financial disclosures, property schedules, preliminary arguments. I focused on breathing evenly. The first contraction hit while Alaric's barrister was discussing the valuation of the business. It wrapped around my lower back before tightening across my abdomen. I gripped my pen harder. Elspeth glanced toward me. I gave the smallest shake of my head. Not now. The contraction eased. The hearing continued. 10 minutes later, another one came. Longer. Sharper. I lowered my eyes to my notebook until it passed. You all right? Elspeth whispered. I'm fine. She didn't look convinced. The judge asked a question about corporate records. Elspeth answered. I concentrated on staying perfectly still. The last thing I wanted was to become the center of attention before we had even begun presenting evidence. Another contraction. I inhaled slowly. Counted to 5. Exhaled. Alaric looked across the courtroom. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He leaned toward his barrister and whispered something. His barrister smiled. Minutes later, during a discussion about scheduling witnesses, the contraction returned with enough force that I couldn't completely hide the wince. Elspeth stood. Your Honor, may we request a brief recess? Before the judge could answer, Alaric's barrister rose. We would object. My client believes this is consistent with previous attempts to postpone proceedings. Elspeth's voice remained calm. My client is 8 months pregnant, which is precisely why today's hearing has already been accommodated. Alaric finally stood. Your Honor, with respect, Isolde has repeatedly claimed medical emergencies whenever difficult conversations arise. My stomach tightened again hard. I pressed one hand beneath the table. Alaric continued speaking. There have been numerous occasions over the past several months where she suddenly become too ill to continue discussions. I stared at him, not because I couldn't believe what he was saying, but because he sounded so practiced, so certain. Sybil couldn't resist adding her own opinion. She's always been dramatic. Several people in the public gallery turned toward her. She shrugged. I'm only telling the truth. The judge looked at me. His expression remained professional. Mrs. Carter, are you able to continue? Another contraction stole my breath. I forced myself to answer. Aye. The sentence never came. Pain cut through me so suddenly I had to brace both hands against the table. Alaric sighed loudly. There it is again. His barrister nodded sympathetically. We believe this pattern speaks for itself. Sybil actually laughed a quiet, dismissive laugh. She's pretending again. The words echoed through the courtroom. For one terrible moment, nobody moved. Even the judge hesitated. Months of Alaric's carefully constructed narrative had done exactly what he intended. It had created doubt. I looked directly at the judge. I think the pressure intensified something's wrong. Alaric shook his head. Your Honor, she said almost the exact same thing during mediation. Another wave crashed through me. This one left no room for pride, no room for strategy, only survival. Then I felt it. A sudden release. Warmth spread beneath me before I even understood what had happened. Water streamed off my chair onto the polished courtroom floor. Silence. Absolute silence. The usher was the first to react. He hurried toward me, looked down once, and immediately turned toward the bench. Your Honor. His voice had completely changed. She's in active labor. Alaric froze. Sybil's smile disappeared. The judge stood so quickly his chair rolled backward. Call 999. The usher was already reaching for his radio. I need an ambulance in Court 3 immediately. 8-month pregnant female, active labor. The clerk pushed back from her desk. Several solicitors moved aside to clear space. Elspeth knelt beside me. Isolde, stay with me. I didn't. I couldn't finish. Another contraction doubled me over. You don't have to talk, she said. Just breathe. A courthouse employee brought a blanket. Someone else carried in bottled water. The entire room that had questioned me less than a minute earlier suddenly revolved around keeping me and my baby safe. Alaric remained standing beside his table, motionless, as if he couldn't understand what he was seeing. The paramedics arrived within minutes, carrying equipment. One of them asked rapid questions. "How far along?" 36 weeks, I answered between breaths. "First baby?" "Yes." Another contraction. The paramedic nodded. "We're taking you now." Before they wheeled me toward the door, the judge spoke. His voice was steady, measured, and unmistakably deliberate. "This hearing is adjourned until further order." He looked directly at the clerk. "Ensure the record accurately reflects the sequence of events beginning with counsel's request for recess. I also want the statements made immediately prior to the medical emergency preserved exactly as spoken," he added. Nobody said a word. Not Alaric, not Sybil, not their barrister. The judge wasn't accusing anyone. He wasn't expressing anger. He wasn't suggesting how the case would ultimately be decided. He was doing something far more important. He was making sure the truth of what had just happened could never be rewritten. As the paramedics rolled me into the hallway, I caught one last glimpse of the courtroom. Alaric was no longer wearing the confident smile he'd carried inside that morning. Sybil wouldn't even meet my eyes. For months, they had built their entire strategy around convincing everyone that I invented illness whenever life became difficult. They hadn't lost the case. Not yet. The evidence still sat unopened inside 4 binders on the solicitor's table. But something far more fragile than any legal argument had just shattered their credibility. Because every person in that courtroom had watched them dismiss a woman in labor as a liar. And once a carefully manufactured story begins collapsing under the weight of undeniable reality, it rarely stops with a single crack. 3 weeks later, I carried my daughter through the front door of our house for the first time. She weighed barely 5 pounds. The neonatal intensive care unit had become our entire world after her early arrival. Every day blurred into feeding schedules, skin-to-skin contact, expressing milk, pediatric updates, and whispered prayers over monitors that seemed louder in the middle of the night. The divorce had become background noise. Not because it no longer mattered, but because my daughter mattered more. I named her Alara. The nurses smiled when I told them. "That's a beautiful name," one of them said. "It fits." It did, because Grace was exactly what had carried me through the weeks that followed. Not revenge, not anger, just the determination to keep moving one day at a time. Elspeth never pressured me. She checked in occasionally, always beginning with the same question. "How's Alara?" Only after hearing that Alara was gaining weight and breathing well on her own would she ask about the case. One afternoon, she visited my house carrying 2 coffees and a thick accordion folder. "You don't have to look at any of this today," she said. "I want to." She sat across from me at the dining room table where Alaric and I had once planned holidays, balanced budgets, and imagined what parenthood would look like. Now the table held baby bottles, muslin cloths, and 4 evidence binders. Life had changed faster than I could have imagined. Elspeth opened the folder. "The court has rescheduled the hearing for next month." I nodded. Alaric's side requested that everything proceed as quickly as possible. I almost smiled. Of course they did. They've also submitted supplemental financial disclosures. "Anything new?" She slid several pages toward me. "I think they realized we're onto the hidden transfers." I studied the documents. The numbers looked cleaner. Too clean. Several accounts that had existed months earlier were suddenly missing. So, they've reorganized everything. They've tried. Elspeth reached into another folder. But they forgot something. She handed me a certified banking response that we had obtained through disclosure. The original transfers were still there. Every wire, every account number, every authorization. No amount of creative bookkeeping could erase a transaction that had already occurred. "They're trapped," I said quietly. "They're cornered," she corrected. "There's a difference." She was right. Trapped people sometimes accepted responsibility. Cornered people often made bigger mistakes. That prediction proved accurate within days. Alaric's solicitor contacted Elspeth with what he described as a reasonable settlement proposal. Reasonable was an interesting choice of words. Alaric would keep complete ownership of the company. He would retain several investment accounts. In exchange, he offered a slightly larger cash settlement than before, and agreed to a standard shared child arrangements order. There was no mention of the hidden money, no acknowledgement of the transfers, no explanation for the missing records. It was simply another attempt to move forward, as though the evidence didn't exist. Elspeth looked at me. We could reject it in one sentence. I looked over at Alara sleeping peacefully in her bassinet. No, What are you thinking? I want them to explain it. She understood immediately. Instead of rejecting the offer, she requested supporting documentation for every financial representation they had made. Within 48 hours, Alaric's legal team produced additional records. Those records contradicted documents they had already filed with the court. Different account balances, different ownership dates, different explanations. The inconsistencies multiplied. By the time the new hearing arrived, our evidence had become even stronger than before Alara was born. Walking back into the courthouse felt strangely different. The same security entrance, the same polished hallways, the same courtroom. But this time, I wasn't carrying months of physical exhaustion alongside months of preparation. I was carrying photographs of my daughter in my bag. That changed everything. When Alaric entered, he looked older. Not dramatically, just worn. His confidence had developed small cracks. Sybil still walked with her usual posture, shoulders straight, chin lifted, but she no longer smiled at me. The judge entered precisely at 9. After the routine introductions, he looked toward both legal teams. We are here today to resolve the remaining issues based upon the evidence presented. No speeches, no references to the previous hearing, only facts. Exactly as it should be. Elspeth stood. Your Honor, we'd like to begin with financial exhibits. For the next hour, she built the case one document at a time. She didn't accuse, she demonstrated. Exhibit 12, Joint Business Account. Documented transfer. Exhibit 13, Bank Confirmation, Receiving Account. Exhibit 14, Corporate Registration Records showing that Sterling Estates Consultancy had no active business relationship with our company. Alaric's barrister objected several times. Elspeth responded calmly each time. The judge admitted the exhibits. Then came the emails one after another. Internal messages discussing timing. Messages about moving funds before valuation. Messages describing the divorce as an opportunity to protect future growth. The courtroom remained quiet. No dramatic reactions, just careful attention. Elspeth then displayed company projections prepared months before the divorce filing. Our flooring firm had been negotiating a multi-year commercial contract with a regional developer. If finalized, the value of the business would increase significantly. The timeline was unmistakable. Alaric had accelerated the divorce before that increase could affect the marital estate. He hadn't rushed because the marriage suddenly became unbearable. He had rushed because the numbers made it advantageous. The judge asked only one question. When was this projection prepared? 5 months before the application was filed, Elspeth answered. The judge made a note. Nothing more. Facts, not emotions. Next came the phone records. Calls placed repeatedly to the same number over several months. Elspeth introduced corresponding text messages obtained during disclosure. The number belonged to another woman. The relationship itself wasn't the central issue. Infidelity alone didn't decide property division. What mattered was timing, business discussions, financial planning, and coordinated meetings, evidence that Alaric had been building a separate future while secretly dismantling the marriage we still legally shared. Alaric finally took the stand. He insisted the transfers were legitimate consulting expenses. Elspeth approached with another document. Can you identify this invoice? Yes. It supports one of those consulting payments. I believe so. She nodded. Would you please read the tax identification number listed here? He did. Elspeth turned toward the judge. Your Honor, the HM Revenue and Customs has confirmed this tax identification number belongs to an unrelated landscaping company in another county. Silence. Alaric looked down at the paper. I wasn't aware of that. You approved the payment. My accounting department handled you personally authorized every transfer. He hesitated. Yes. She returned to the counsel table without another word. She didn't need one. The document spoke for itself. Then came Sybil. She testified confidently at first. She described me as emotional, overwhelmed, and prone to exaggeration. Elspeth listened patiently. Then she approached with printed emails. Mrs. Carter, do you recognize this message? Sybil adjusted her glasses. I might. You wrote, keep documenting every time Isolde claims she's too sick, too emotional, or too overwhelmed. The court needs to see a pattern. Sybil shifted slightly. I was worried about my son. Were you documenting actual events? Of course. Elspeth displayed another email. This one had been sent 3 days before Sybil made comments to our neighbor. You also wrote, people believe what they hear repeatedly. Sybil remained silent. Did you intentionally encourage others to believe Isolde routinely exaggerated medical problems? No. Elspeth handed her another exhibit. Security camera footage time-stamped from our front porch showed Sybil speaking with Mrs. Higgins exactly when she claimed I had been too sick to get out of bed. At that very same time, company time records showed I had been working a full day at the office. Sybil looked toward Alaric. He avoided her eyes. No one raised their voice. No one celebrated. No one needed to. The evidence dismantled their credibility piece by piece. By late afternoon, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Hidden assets, false financial disclosures, coordinated efforts to damage my credibility, manipulated narratives. Every major claim Alaric had relied upon weakened under documentary proof. The judge closed his notebook. I have heard sufficient evidence. He looked at both solicitors. I will issue my ruling after reviewing the complete record. As everyone stood to leave, I glanced once at the 4 binders. Months earlier, Alaric had believed those binders contained nothing more than desperate accusations from a frightened pregnant woman. Instead, they contained bank records, emails, timestamps, corporate filings, and objective facts. He hadn't lost because I went into labor in his courtroom. He hadn't lost because people felt sorry for me. He was losing because evidence does not care who cries the loudest. It only cares what can be proven. The judge issued his ruling 2 weeks later. There was no packed courtroom, no television cameras, no dramatic speeches, just the quiet formality of a legal system doing exactly what it was designed to do when the evidence had finally been laid out in full. Ilara was asleep in a carrier beside Elspeth when the hearing began. She was still tiny, though she'd gained nearly 2 pounds since coming home from the hospital. Every morning, she seemed a little stronger, a little more determined to catch up to the world she had entered too early. I hoped the rest of our lives would follow the same path. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at several pages of notes. I have reviewed the testimony, documentary evidence, financial records, and post-hearing submissions. His voice remained steady. The court's responsibility is not to reward one party or punish another. It is to apply the law to the facts established by credible evidence. Exactly what he had done from the beginning, exactly what I had been counting on. He started with the business, based on financial projections, hidden transfers, incomplete disclosures, and documented attempts to reduce the marital estate before valuation. The court rejected Alaric's proposed valuation entirely. Instead, an independent forensic accounting had been ordered. Its findings confirmed that substantial marital assets had been concealed. The revised valuation significantly increased the total marital estate. Alaric lowered his eyes. The judge continued. The court finds that numerous financial transfers were intentionally withheld from accurate disclosure. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every word carried weight because it rested on documents instead of assumptions. The hidden funds were added back into the estate. The property division was recalculated accordingly. I received a substantially larger share than Alaric had offered in his proposed settlement months earlier. Not because I deserved sympathy, but because the money had belonged to both of us. The judge then addressed the child arrangements. He recognized that Ilara had been born prematurely and required stability, routine, and cooperation from both parents. A joint child arrangements order remained appropriate, but the parenting schedule reflected the reality of an infant who depended primarily on me during her first year. Alaric would have meaningful parenting time. He would remain Ilara's father. The court was not interested in erasing him from her life. Neither was I. Children deserved parents, even when marriages failed. Then came the issue. None of us had expected to become part of the official ruling. The court is deeply concerned, the judge said, by evidence demonstrating coordinated efforts to portray Mrs. Carter as medically unreliable, despite the absence of supporting medical evidence. The courtroom became perfectly still. He wasn't talking about labor anymore. He was talking about months of planning, emails, conversations, witnesses, a carefully manufactured story. The court assigns limited weight to testimony that has been shown to be intentionally influenced by such conduct. That single sentence carried enormous consequences. It meant Alaric and Sybil had permanently damaged their own credibility before the court. Years of carefully managing appearances disappeared in one paragraph. The judge turned another page. Questions regarding certain financial transactions exceed the scope of this domestic proceeding. I felt Elspeth glance toward me. The relevant documentation shall be transmitted to the appropriate authorities for any review they consider necessary. No accusations, no criminal findings, simply a referral, exactly as the law required. Alaric closed his eyes for a brief moment. Months of secret transfers had not simply cost him money. They had created questions that would continue long after our divorce became final. When the judge finished, he looked at both solicitors. "Counsel, prepare the final judgment consistent with today's findings." Then he looked directly at us. "I encourage both parties to remember that successful co-parenting requires honesty that should have existed long before this litigation." With that, he stood. The hearing was over. Outside the courthouse, reporters weren't waiting. Neither were crowds. Only ordinary people walking to lunch beneath a clear autumn sky. Elspeth helped me buckle Alara into her pram. "You okay?" she asked. I took a slow breath. "I think so." "You won." I looked down at my daughter. "No." She smiled. "No. I got the truth. There was a difference. Winning implied someone else's defeat had become my goal. It never had. I hadn't spent months collecting evidence because I wanted Alaric to suffer. I had done it because I refused to let lies decide my daughter's future. Over the following months, life became wonderfully ordinary. The business continued under new management after the settlement. I eventually sold my remaining ownership interest and accepted a financial consulting position with another company that offered regular hours and far less stress. Alara grew stronger every week. She learned to laugh before she learned to crawl. She loved bath time, disliked peas with surprising intensity, and somehow managed to pull every book off the lowest shelf in the living room. Alaric remained part of her life. He arrived on time for visits. He asked questions at pediatric appointments. He slowly began acting more like the father Alara deserved than the husband he had been to me. People can change. Not always, but sometimes. As for Sybil, our conversations became limited to polite exchanges during handovers. Nothing more, nothing less. The court record already contained everything that needed to be said. Months passed. Then one Saturday afternoon, just before Alara's first birthday, I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard an unfamiliar little squeal. I turned around. Alara had pulled herself away from the coffee table. One step, then another. Her arms stretched toward me. Her face lit up with determination. She stumbled the last few inches into my embrace. I laughed so hard I started crying. Not because she had taken 2 tiny steps, but because those steps reminded me of everything we had survived to reach that moment. People sometimes ask whether giving birth in the courtroom was the most difficult part of my story. It wasn't. The hardest part had been everything that came before. Carrying a child while carrying betrayal. Managing a business while managing fear. Preparing legal evidence while pretending not to notice deception unfolding inside my own marriage. Remaining silent while people mistook restraint for weakness. There were days I wanted to scream. Days I wanted to confront Alaric with every document I had uncovered. Days I wanted to expose every lie immediately. I'm grateful now that I didn't, because anger might have given me temporary satisfaction. Patience gave me the truth, and truth lasted longer. Looking back, I no longer see the courtroom as the place where my life fell apart. I see it as the place where pretending finally ended. The moment my water broke wasn't the reason the judge ruled in my favor. It simply forced everyone to stop believing a story that facts had never supported. The documents did the rest. The emails, the bank records, the timelines, the evidence. Justice was never my revenge. Freedom was the freedom to raise my daughter without constantly defending my own reality. The freedom to build a future that no longer depended on someone else's approval. The freedom to know that integrity had survived even when my marriage had not. If Alara ever asks me one day why I kept fighting when everything seemed stacked against me, I'll tell her the simplest truth I know. Because some things are worth protecting quietly until the evidence can speak louder than the lies. Final message. True justice is built on evidence, integrity, and perseverance. The strongest people are often the ones who suffer quietly while preparing for the day when the truth can finally speak for itself. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe for more powerful stories about resilience, betrayal, justice, and second chances. And if you've ever learned that patience and truth can be stronger than anger, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your story.